Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom, and also welcome to our viewers on C-SPAN who are joining us. It's my great pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Owen Paterson MP. I've known Owen now for nearly 2 decades, dating back to when he was Parliamentary Private Secretary to then Leader of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan-Smith, and I was working in Lady Thatcher's private office in London. Owen has always been a highly principled Conservative, as well as a robust transatlanticist and ardent supporter of the US-UK special relationship. He's been an outstanding and dedicated MP for North Shropshire since 1997 and served as Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. He was one of the first British Conservatives to support Brexit and more recently has been a prominent critic of Prime Minister Theresa May's Chequers Agreement, which prompted the resignations of both the Foreign Secretary and Brexit Secretary when it was announced in July. Owen has urged the British government to fully restore Britain's sovereignty when it exits the EU in 2019 and has called on the United States and the United Kingdom to negotiate and sign a free trade deal that would further advance the economic partnership between the world's largest and 5th largest economies. Please join me in welcoming my very good friend, Owen Paterson.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Niall, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to return to Heritage. Yet again, I was here about a year ago, and it gives me the opportunity to update you on the progress of the Brexit negotiations. I want to highlight why a free-trading global United Kingdom is so important to the United States, and what a huge difference cooperation between like-minded people in Washington and Westminster can make in securing that outcome. When I last spoke to you, I outlined the clear democratic mandate on which Brexit stands. At the 2015 general election, the Conservatives promised that, if elected, they would hold a decisive in or out referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union. The party was returned to government with an increased number of votes and seats in the House of Commons. When that referendum was held in 2016, 17.4 million people voted to leave the EU, more than have ever voted for any issue or political party in British history. This was a decisive vote to leave, but did not specify the precise details. In her speech at Lancaster House in January 2017, the Prime Minister gave the detail what leaving would look like. She said, "We do not seek membership of the single market. Full customs union membership prevents us from negotiating our own comprehensive trade deals. We will take back control of our laws and bring an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice." At the 2017 general election, the Conservatives reiterated this, pledging that, and I quote again, "As we leave the European Union, we will no longer be members of the single market or customs union." The party won more votes than any party for 25 years. The Labour Party also endorsed leaving the single market and the customs union, so that 85% of the overall votes cast at the election were for parties which had defined Brexit as leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, and leaving the remit of the European Court of Justice. The principal Remain party, the Liberal Democrats, actually saw its numbers of votes fall. Since then, the government has published its most disappointing Chequers Agreement, setting out its proposals for the future UK-EU relationship. This document, however, fails to deliver the Conservative Brexit Manifesto pledge in anything but name. It's even strongly opposed, and I quote, by the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier. A former president of the Dutch Customs Association has expressed his dismay that the plan does not even explain how cross-border value-added tax would be handled. It is completely unacceptable, and I will vote against it. The paper proposes that the UK remains as if in a, quote, combined customs territory with the EU alongside a commitment to, quote, a common rule book for trade in goods, including agri-foods. This would see the UK collecting tariffs on behalf of the EU, and worse still, bound to European rules on all goods, including food and agricultural products. The common in common rulebook is a complete misnomer. It is nothing but the European Union rulebook, over which the UK will lose its right to vote once we leave. We will not even help to draft the rules. The Chequers Agreement accepts this, but meekly states that we should be consulted as European rules are changed. A sovereign state merely being consulted on the rules imposed upon it would not be taking back control. We are told that Parliament will have the ability to reject further changes to EU law. Yet Chequers also says that the UK will, quote, commit by treaty to ongoing harmonisation in areas covered by the EU rulebook. Parliament's supposed independence comes on the condition that the EU can impose consequences should MPs ever have the temerity to exercise this theoretical right, leaving us as a permanent rule-taking supplicant without any practical chance of amending the laws that are imposed upon us. Crucially, accepting the terms of Chequers would severely impede the UK's ability to strike new trading arrangements around the world and so embrace the chief economic opportunities of Brexit. That is obviously bad news for the UK, but it's also bad news for the United States. To see why, consider the existential battle currently being played out across the world. The battle of ideas between competition-led capitalism and state-led intervention, between competition and cronyism. Our enemies are poverty and wealth destruction. I believe that wealth can be created or destroyed. I believe it is more difficult to create than it is to destroy. I believe that competition, exercised by a free people, based on the quality of their ideas and their capacity for hard work, is the greatest force mankind has ever known to create it. Where cronyism, protectionism, and overregulation have destroyed wealth, suppressing technology, and pushed people deeper into poverty, competition has spurred spectacularly innovative ideas and turned them into companies that employ hundreds of thousands of people. Over the last 2 decades, with markets opening up after the fall of communism, 1 billion people have been lifted out of penury. Over 100,000 people every day. Paul Ehrlich famously wrote in 1968, and I quote, "The battle to feed all humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now." Then, the food supply was under 2,000 calories per person per day in 34 of 152 countries. By 2013, that was true in only 2 of 173. Technological improvements, open markets, and the spread of democracy have seen famine all but disappear outside war zones. The key figure was Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, whose work saved the lives of 1 billion people. Borlaug's pioneering work created high-yield, disease-resistant wheat and rice varieties, which could be grown in varying climates. By 1963, 95% of Mexico's wheat was Borlaug's variety, and the harvest had grown by 6 times from what it had been before his breakthrough. Borlaug then began shipping his seeds to India and Pakistan in order to combat the appalling starvation crisis. His new technologies were rapidly adopted. Now, Paquet Ehrlich India and Pakistan have been net food exporters for decades. Borlaug is recognized as one of the great heroes of the 20th century. He is one of only 7 to receive the Congressional Gold Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, as well as the Nobel Peace Prize. The UK and the US have for centuries promoted competition on the basis of that great aspirational principle, the heart of the American dream, that your children can have a life better than yours. From Magna Carta to the Industrial Revolution, you've taken British ideas, forged in the fires of competition, and made them an exemplary reality for the rest of the world. And I hope you will permit me to say that we played some role in your success. We've had our differences, of course, and the US staged its own version of Brexit in 1776. But there are clear similarities between the American fight for independence in the 18th century and the UK's desire to govern our own affairs in the 21st. Then, as now, the dissatisfaction stemmed from the overreach of a remote, unrepresentative power embodied by the famous rallying cry of no taxation without representation. Thomas Paine observed, the quote, "There is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island." Those same impulses of democratic control are people wishing to decide who spends their money, who shapes their destiny, and having power to remove their rulers by voting, underpin that Brexit vote. There is something equally absurd in supposing our islands to be perpetually governed by a continent. There are also lessons from our shared history that any kind of vindictive negotiation settlement is not the answer. By contrast, following the War of Independence, the extraordinarily magnanimous Jay Treaty of 1794 paved the way for a decade of peaceful trade between our two nations on a mutual, most favored nation basis. Alongside American traders gaining rights to operate in the British West Indies, we agreed that disputes over the Canadian border and a number of wartime debts would be settled by the then almost unknown means of arbitration, setting an example which other nations were to follow. Chief Justice Jay and the then British Foreign Secretary Lord Grenville showed extraordinary foresight in recognizing the need to move on from the war and the revolution in favor, and I quote from the treaty, quote, "a firm, inviolable, and universal peace, and a true and sincere friendship between His Britannic Majesty, his heirs and successors, and the United States of America, and between their respective countries, territories, cities, towns, and people of every degree, without exception of persons or places. Seek an agreement," and I go on, "between His Majesty and the United States of America, that there shall be a reciprocal and entirely perfect liberty of navigation and commerce between their respective people." The decade following the signing of the treaty saw US exports rise from $33 million in 1794 to $78 million in 1804. Over the same period, US imports rose from $36 million to $87 million. There is surely a lesson here for the UK and EU negotiators as to how a mutually beneficial, amicable solution can be reached. Any who are tempted to see the negotiations as a means of punishment would do well to remember Edmund Burke's words on conciliation with America. He said, "I can scarcely conceive anything more completely imprudent than for the head of the empire to insist that if any privilege is pleaded against his will or his acts, that his whole authority is denied, instantly to proclaim rebellion, to beat to arms, and to put the offending provinces under the ban. Will not this, sir, very soon teach the provinces to make no distinction on their part? Will it not teach them that the government against which a claim of liberty is tantamount to high treason is a government to which submission is equivalent to slavery?" Our two nations are now once again joined in a common cause and a common struggle. It's a struggle to show the world that where competition is weakened or crushed, where government replaces what the private sector can do, people lose out. The poorest in society lose out most of all. Look at Venezuela. Brexit is a key event in this struggle. It must be used to reshape the UK as a strong, independent nation and a powerful advocate for global free trade. We can set our own policies to maximise competition, improving quality and driving down prices for all consumers. We've heard much on the media about the concerns of big producers, many of which are multinational businesses. Yet only 12% of our economy is accounted for by exports to the EU. The European Commission itself says that 90% of global economic growth in the next 10 to 15 years is expected to be generated outside Europe. We must remember that the costs of EU regulation are felt throughout the whole economy, including by businesses which do not export to Europe, and most especially by 100% of consumers. Outside the customs union, economists for free trade suggest that the poorest households will be 15% better off. If the US and UK can agree a free trade agreement, which sees the UK out of the EU's regulatory sphere, it will be enormously beneficial to the US's farmers, businesses, and consumers. Such an agreement is in the American interest because the US and UK face the same problems from Chinese market distortions, such as an overcapacity of supply in the steel industry. Our inability to deal with such distortions has fueled questions over the whole concept of trade liberalisation and its capacity to alleviate poverty and create wealth. In turn, this has led to a political culture of ever greater regulation and ever weakened private sector. But a new, independent UK trade policy can make the case for free trade afresh. It can build on 4 fundamental pillars which reflect what we can do unilaterally, bilaterally, as a member of global bodies, including the WTO. Part of the bilateral agenda is an agreement between the UK and the US, while we are also negotiating agreements between the UK and the EU. You might be tempted to say, well, we'll wait and see what your agreement is with the EU before we proceed with you. That would seem logical. But as you know, the UK will be negotiating and able to sign new agreements in the implementation period, beginning from the point of our formal exit from the EU in March 2019. It's simply not feasible for you to wait for our negotiation with the EU to conclude and then sign a deal with us for this reason. If our negotiations with the US and the EU are not concurrent, the UK will be forced into the regulatory regime of the EU in some fashion, and there will be no prospect of a serious trade deal in the future. If that occurs, the US will have lost a significant opportunity. Firstly, you've said clearly in trade fora that you are not protectionist. The US has been one of the strongest forces for liberalised trade on the planet. A deal with the UK, a country at a similar socio-economic level, so there can be no race to the bottom, or offshored US jobs, a country where there is a balanced trade relationship, is the ideal candidate for your bilateral agenda. We are each other's largest source of foreign direct investment. We both employ over 1 million of each other's citizens. Despite his many protectionist actions, President Trump knew this when he proposed a bold free trading vision at the Quebec G7 meeting in June. No tariffs, no barriers, he said. That's the way it should be. He also knew that 3 G7 members, France, Germany, and Italy, bound by the EU's external tariffs, are not capable of joining that project. This also highlights my second point, the possibility of a significant European power moving away from the prescriptive approach of the EU's rulebook to a system based on outcomes, which could signal a significant shift in the battle of ideas. The Chequers Agreement proposes to keep us tied to the EU's extreme technological risk aversion, which has held back innovation for us in the UK. Once again, it is completely unacceptable, and we must now break free from it. US industries have long complained about the EU's regulatory system, embedded by a ferocious application of the precautionary principle. This was exemplified by a recent European court ruling that organisms created using pioneering gene editing techniques should be subject to the same almost prohibitive regulatory hurdles as those created by genetic modification. It will have, as plant physiologist Professor Stefan Jansson from the Umeå University in Sweden put it, quote, a chilling effect on research in the same way that GMO legislation has had a chilling effect for 15 years now. It's an appalling indictment of this regime that the world's largest chemical company, BASF, has abandoned all further biotechnology research for the European market. Their entire blight-resistant potato project has moved to the USA, which is terrible news for those UK farmers forced to spray their potatoes dozens of times in the absence of a blight-resistant crop. Bayer is soon to follow suit and take its biotech research elsewhere. Europe's reluctance to adopt the latest innovations in agriculture diminishes potential yield and uses up more land than is needed. US corn yields have overtaken those of France in the last 20 years. Now France is missing out on over 4.5 tons per hectare compared to the US, amounting to a total loss of 6.1 million tons across its 1.5 million hectares. If France had kept pace with US technology, that crop could be worth an extra 1.2 billion US dollars to French agriculture, or France could free up 500,000 hectares currently used for the same crop and put it to use for wildlife, recreation, or forestry. Leaving the EU means that the UK can strengthen our role by retaking a full seat on the world bodies that determine global regulation, at which we are currently represented by the EU collectively. These include the WTO, the World Organization for Animal Health, OIE, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which regulates guidelines on food and food safety, and the International Plant Protection Convention. In so doing, we will regain our right to vote on such bodies, as well as our right to initiate new standards and propose amendments to existing ones, working closely with like-minded allies. Thirdly, we're both affected by the kinds of anti-competitive distortions of the market in China and elsewhere. We can do in our agreement what had been the hope in the TTIP, a 21st century set of disciplines that could be applied to third parties. We wish you well in your negotiations with the EU, but the US must determine whether you think that the kind of deal you wish to negotiate, one that lessens distortions and eliminates unnecessary bureaucracy, would be easier with the EU than it would be with the UK. The fact that we will both be negotiating with them at the same time will help us both to reach a better understanding with the EU. The fourth reason that a US-UK trade deal is so important for both parties draws upon the strength and endurance of the bond between our two countries. We're united by our history, we're united by our culture, and perhaps most of all, by our language. We have a shared system of values. The British Council recently surveyed young Americans who ranked the UK first against 7 other major countries for, quote, being a force for good in the world, having a free press, fair justice system, and strong non-governmental institutions, valuing individual liberty, and being a strong example of a democratic society. We have shared geostrategic and geopolitical interests in sectors like defense, intelligence, financial services, pharmaceuticals, where our industries form part of an integrated whole. Broadening that market, with the UK once again becoming a rule setter for the world rather than a rule taker, will be most important. Together, we can push back against those who seek to suppress the extraordinary efforts in wealth creation that have lifted so many out of poverty since 1945. For too long, the UK has languished, unable to play the full partner you've needed to make this case around the world. No longer. But we need your help to emerge as a full member of the WTO and other bodies, undamaged. And we need your help to ensure we break free of too close a regulatory bind with the EU. It was excellent to hear your ambassador in London, Woody Johnson, say this summer. I quote him again, "I'm super confident about the relationship between the US and the UK. I'm very confident about our future together, and I'm very confident about what happens after Brexit." I share his confidence. Brexit marks a crucial moment in the battle for the heart of the global regulatory system. The US must act now with determination and the entrepreneurial spirit that has characterized your nation from its beginning. The US must take full advantage of this unique opportunity to have the world's fifth largest economy and second biggest exporter of services push hard for competition-based regulatory and trade policy alongside you. Together, we can turn back the tide of anti-competitive regulation around the world, and we can create wealth where it has previously been destroyed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Owen. That was a terrific and extremely informative speech. And now I'd like to invite questions from the audience for you. I'm going to actually kick off, though, with the opening question, Owen. Just a few days ago, the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, issued dire warnings about the consequences of a no-deal Brexit. He said there'll be a collapse of the housing market, a surge in unemployment. Similar things to, I think, what he was saying before the Brexit referendum. And we seem to be sort of going through another, project fear from those who initially opposed Brexit in the first place. Could you talk about the resurgence of project fear, and if indeed there is a no-deal Brexit, what would that look like for the United Kingdom?
Well, you're quite right about Project Fear. I think we're probably up to about Project Fear Mark 5 or 6. I think in fairness to the governor, having let the comments run, he had briefed on what would be the worst possible outcome. He only then sort of corrected that after the story had really got going. The Bank of England and Her Majesty's Treasury have been heroically wrong on their forecasts. To such an extent, they're actually comical. And nobody really takes them that seriously beyond the establishment. Outside the establishment, you talk to businesses, the most common phrase are 5 very simple English words: just get on with it. The British people were bombarded by Project Fear by the then Chancellor, George Osborne, by terrifying forecasts. We're talking about 800,000 increase in unemployment if we voted to leave, a huge drop in prices, disaster all round. There would be slime coming out of the taps and snakes coming out of the drains. It's all a bit wrong, actually. We have had record foreign inward investment, we've got record employment, and we've got steady growth, doing better than most European countries. So I think most of these project fits, and they've tried it time and time again. They don't learn. It doesn't work. The British people have voted to leave. They know what that meant. They knew perfectly well. It meant leaving the customs union, it meant leaving the single market, it meant leaving the remit of the ECJ, and they expect that to be delivered. They're not going to be blown off course by the Remainer establishment. And don't forget, the political establishment is pro-Remain, the commercial establishment, the commercial organisations, who are only, that's the 12% of GDP concerned with exports to the EU, they're Remain. I suspect the judicial establishment is Remain if they had half a chance to get their paws on it. And the media establishment is overwhelmingly pro-Remain. It hasn't worked. The polls are absolutely solid where they were before. The British people voted to take back control so that they control their money, control their borders, and they had the power to kick the rascals out if they made bad laws, none of which they can do at the moment.
Very well said, Owen. I'd like to invite questions now on the floor, please do identify yourself and any institutional affiliation that you may have. Please do keep your questions as well very brief and to the point. Right, I have a question right here in the front.
So my name's Boston, and I go to. Sorry, can you wait till we get to the microphone? Yes, absolutely. So my name's Boston, and I go to Gonzaga University. My question is, Britain is obviously a nation with a great, remarkable history. Is there a sort of sentiment with Brexit to restore Britain's, greatness? Is that something that, a sentiment amongst British people?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, there's a strong belief of people who want to take back control that we can do a lot better than we are now. We are held back by not making our own laws. We're held back by this anti-competitive and extraordinarily anti-technology belief within the European Union. So absolutely, we can do a lot better. But what I find going around the world is that we will be welcomed. So if you look at the immediately close, most likely countries, the United States or Canada, you take New Zealand or Australia, Alexander Downer, who was, for instance, the Foreign Secretary in Australia and has recently been their High Commissioner, their ambassador. He's been very outspoken about wanting to really work with a newly independent UK and restore links. Very similar, Lockwood Smith, who was he was the Ag Minister, he was the Trade Minister, and he also was recently been a time in London as the High Commissioner, really looking forward to re-establish links with the UK. The opportunities with India, with Africa. I gave a speech at Cornell on technology in agri-tech, and this was 2 years ago now, and their eyes were lit up. There were bright young technologists from Bangladesh and India, and they were welcoming us back, a bit like Sleeping Beauty. They said, I can't believe the UK is really going to be back working on this stuff. We'll be cooperating with you. It's going to be really exciting. So absolutely, we've got this extraordinary history linking around the world. We are at the center of the time zones. It's 8 hours to California, it's 8 hours to Hong Kong. And our history gives us this amazing network of contacts. And we want the best possible relations with our European neighbors. But the key figure I gave you in that speech is that the European Union itself says 90% of world growth is going to be outside the European Union. And that's where our growth is.
Take a question, actually, right at the back there, Patrick Wilson.
Hello, welcome back to Washington. My question, I couldn't help by being reminded, you talked about snakes in the drain and all the terrible predictions about Brexit. There was very little accountability for all the same intelligentsia's view that if we didn't join the Euro project, that Britain would be in the tank. It would be destroyed if we weren't a part of the Euro currency. Why do you feel there's not accountability for how those very same pundits got that wrong, so wrong, as Britain is still the financial capital of all of Europe and one of the most important financial cities in the world?
Very good question. I mean, there are large organizations, commercial organizations that said we should join the ERM, which was the procedure of the Euro, said everything would be disastrous if the City of London collapsed. We didn't join the Euro. Then all these ludicrous predictions of Project Fear if we were stupid enough to vote to leave, none of which has come about. Amazingly, these guys still get airtime. They still get articles in The Economist and on Financial Times. They still appear on the radio, and they're listened to with reverence. I actually tend to listen to people who get things right. So I would strongly recommend you go to a paper written only last week by Economists for Free Trade. Oh, sorry, no, I didn't pick up your comment on World Trade Terms, which shows very clearly that we should not be frightened of moving to World Trade Terms. And that's written by people like Professor Patrick Minford, who was absolutely right on predicting the success of the Thatcher reforms, was absolutely right on the ERM, was absolutely right on the Euro, was absolutely right on what would happen after the referendum. He is mocked as our maverick. I actually rather tend to listen to him because he tends to be right, as opposed to the others who've been comically and laughably wrong.
Let's see, lady.
Hi, Hannah Monacan with Inside U.S. Trade. Good to see you again. I just had a quick question. I know you mentioned that you'd love to see the U.S. be more engaged with the U.K. as you guys are negotiating with the EU to sort of put forward the competitive regulatory system. And so I'm curious, as far as I understand, what if you can't officially negotiate yet until you've left the European Union for a trade deal, what steps would you envision the US and the UK taking up to that point to sort of lay that groundwork for a future trade deal?
Well, get cracking and start talking and start negotiating and start drafting. There was a launch yesterday of a draft free trade association treaty with centrally and think tanks from centre-right Washington, centre-right Westminster, which is a very good start. But I think you need to realise time is short on this. You can start negotiating now. We can't sign anything, obviously, but you can get drafting and start working on it. And there's a double vicious circle and there's a double virtuous circle here. It's worth pointing out, and I was the DEFRA secretary. DEFRA is Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, so that's basically agriculture, fisheries and the environment. And I represented the UK in negotiations in the EU on the common agricultural policy. Now, the proposals, some of them were absolutely inimical to us. And I worked very carefully building alliances. We worked very closely with the Germans on some stuff. The Hungarians, for instance, were very good. And I stopped some of the stupider things happening. But we were generally outvoted. And we accepted an agricultural regime which is still very, very unsatisfactory. It doesn't deliver agricultural outcomes, it doesn't deliver environmental outcomes. But we were fighting, and we were partly successful in restraining the EU. If we are sucked into the Chequers arrangement, we will not be involved in that process. We will have absolutely no restraint on what goes on. And the worst aspects and attitudes of European regulation will be what's passed in law. It'll come to us and we'll have to absorb it. Now that's really bad for the United States, because if you have Europe being anti-competitive, anti-technology, and you've got all the statist inclinations in China, the United States is going to find itself on its own. You contrast that the other way. Also, you'll have lost a potential customer because we won't be able to do a free trade deal, and we won't be able to work with you on the world bodies. Contrast if we are properly independent and we've done a free trade arrangement with you. We will be working with you on pushing pro-competition projects, on pro-technology projects. We haven't had a trade round for over 20 years. The Doha round is dead. It's absolutely outrageous. That's why you've still got poverty around the world. That's why you've got this desperate refugee crisis in Europe, where people cannot generate wealth and stay in Africa. They're trying to cross the Mediterranean. The world desperately needs to increase free trade opportunities, and we will be working with you on that. That will mean that the EU will be the outlier, and the EU will then have to follow us. So if we're working with the United States and New Zealand and Canada, Australia, and possibly Switzerland, Israel, wherever, other sort of Anglosphere countries with our attitude, that will absolutely force the EU to come along after us. Whereas if we're out of it, I'm afraid exactly the opposite. Your big corporates here, they will kowtow. They say, okay, well, we'll just accept this regulation. So your big chemical companies, as a classic example, they hated the REACH regulation. They really, really hated it. They campaigned against it, but now they have to accept it. Now, if we're out, you can possibly battle against that. If we're still in, you're lost. And your big corporates will go along, and the result of that will be a global disaster. That will mean there will be less innovation, there will be less competition worldwide, and that is bad news for the most marginal economies and the benighted human beings living in them.
Hi, David Smith of The Guardian. So do you think no deal is preferable to a bad deal? And do you think Theresa May should continue as Prime Minister, or should she stand down?
Good old British press gets you back to personalities. We say this is about policy, it's not about personalities. We want the Prime Minister to deliver on her election manifesto, which she was elected on in Maidenhead and I was elected on in North Shropshire. That is to deliver leave by leaving the single market, by leaving the customs union, by leaving the remit of the European Court of Justice. I'm not the rebel. I'm absolutely in line with standard conservative thought. My own association voted unanimously last week for that programme and supported me on opposing checkers. Obviously, no deal is going to be far better than checkers. We trade with the United States on world trade terms. We trade with China on world trade terms. The vast majority of trade is on world trade terms. Canada has done a deal with the EU on trade, and it doesn't pay in a penny. So we don't pay the 39 billion. There isn't a single member of parliament that doesn't have really good causes in his constituency that could use 39 billion pounds sterling very, very quickly. So they don't get a penny of the 39 billion. And if you go to the Economist for Free Trade paper last week, there is nothing to be frightened of. Obviously, it would be much better to do a free trade deal with the European Union. It would be much better to do a Canada plus, or actually just forget Canada. We want to do a really good, broad, deep free trade deal. That would be much the best option. And there's still time to do it. And what I very much hope is that we last week, that's the European Research Group I was involved in, we published a paper on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which up to now has been an impediment. We show conclusively that using existing technologies and existing administrative systems, that problem can be sorted to the satisfaction of the EU, so you do not prejudice the integrity of the single market customs union. We then need to ditch checkers, which I will predict is not going to get through Parliament. There are 80 members of the ERG who will vote against it, and the Labour Party last week said that they will vote against it. So let's just park checkers, forget about it, put it to bed, it's dead, little quiet burial in the corner, and get on and start talking now about a free trade deal between the UK and the European Union.
The fellow right there, actually just, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm a student at the University of Richmond in Virginia. And for the past decades, the EU and the US have been the largest trade partners in the world. And it seems that the US has benefited quite a bit from that, both from a technological, agricultural standpoint. What would a UK negotiating with the US and then EU negotiating with the US separately, what would that add more to the US? How could the US benefit more from that than what they're benefiting from right now?
Well, there are all sorts of products which are shut out of the European Union by the European Union's tariff barriers. So why do my poorest constituents have to pay above world prices for oranges, for instance, in order to protect European orange growers? We don't grow oranges in the UK, so we just buy oranges wherever we can. But because we're within the customs union, we pay excessive prices for oranges. So bring it on. Let's let Spanish orange growers compete with Californian and Florida ones. So my whole speech is about the opportunities. It isn't all golden at the moment. It is protectionist. There is a barrier. The customs union shuts out products from this country. There are some things, go back to David Ricardo, law of comparative advantage. The US is very, very good at making some things. Europe is very, very good at making other things. They should both be able to sell as freely as possible.
And so Dr. Ted Bromond over there, and then I'll take the next question afterwards. Thank you.
Ted Bromond from the Heritage Foundation. Very much enjoyed your remarks. Thank you very much. About 6 months ago, we hosted an Irish delegation here. I won't name them for fear of causing them embarrassment. I asked them privately whether they were concerned about Brexit, and their comment was, no, actually, what we're concerned about is what the European Union will look like after Britain leaves. We're concerned about the actions they will take, the EU will take. Could you comment a little bit on what you see as the EU's direction of travel after Britain leaves?
Well, I think your Irish delegates were absolutely right. The Irish are going to feel quite isolated. I mean, at the moment, we work very closely with them. We have a lot in common with them. We think alike. They're a splendidly entrepreneurial country with whom we get on really closely. And they're going to feel lonely in a very small minority once we've gone, because all the things I was touching on, the nature of lawmaking, there will be no restraint by a strongly pro-technology and pro-competition UK. These laws will be cooked up. And of course, when they come to us, there will be absolutely nothing we can do about it, which is if we're stupid enough to sign up to checkers, that's our problem. But for Ireland, that's bad. Ireland really depends on technology and all the exciting new industries they brought in, because they very sensibly brought their corporation tax down to 12.5%, which I was very much involved in defending when I was the Secretary of State in Northern Ireland. So the Irish economy is growing really strongly at the moment. They've come back from a very difficult time, and all credit to them. But they absolutely depend on free trade and competition and technologies. And sadly, they're going to find themselves very, very isolated.
Thank you. I'm with the Embassy of Ireland here in Washington, D.C. Just first of all, thank you for your presentation. Of course, the negotiations are taking place in Brussels between the EU negotiators and the UK government negotiators, and Ireland is part of the EU. We regret that the UK is leaving the EU, but we will remain very much part of it. And while we will miss the UK, I don't agree with your characterisation of how we will be post Brexit. But in any event, you know, I think we will be fine, but we will work within the EU to maintain its current values, and we will work to maintain the close relationship which we want to see continue between the EU and the UK. And of course, our overall priority is the protection of the Good Friday Agreement and the avoidance of a hard border on the island of Ireland, which is of crucial importance. And again, I heard with interest what you said about the ERG proposals on technological solutions. We are not convinced that technological solutions are possible, but we are willing in the negotiations to hear any reasonable proposals towards that end. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid you are going to be outnumbered, I'm afraid. With qualified majority voting, Ireland has a very small number of votes, and it's going to be the big cats that will dominate the EU. You are just going to be outvoted, whereas we were a major ally with you. On the issue of the border between Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland, I do recommend the paper we wrote last week. Emphatically, the biggest threat to the Good Friday Agreement is to tear up the principle of consent, which is the absolute core of it. And the proposal, which Barnier is still enunciating, and I had to write a letter to the Times with one of my colleagues last week. You're shaking your head, but David Trimble, who was one of the architects and wrote the Belfast Agreement with others, is very clear about this. If there is an artificial border put down the Irish Sea between GB and Northern Ireland, that is a direct contradiction of the Belfast Agreement. It breaks the principle of consent. And it is completely unacceptable, totally unacceptable. It is much the biggest threat. So what our paper shows, and I got laughed at because I said it's boring, because if I hadn't said that, it would have been mocked as being crazy and wacky-twacky ideas. Every single technology in that paper is being used this morning around the world. Every single administrative procedure is being used this morning within the EU. There is nothing new. I very deliberately said that in the paper. And it's a matter of great regret that Enda Kenny had started talks on these sort of solutions, and that work has been stopped. And I would strongly urge the Republic of Ireland. I worked very closely with Simon Coveney, who's the Taoiseach State. He's a really good guy. We would never have got the CAP reform through without his skills and knowledge of agriculture, but his skills at driving it through. And I worked very closely with him. And we had all sorts of excitement, like horse meat scandals. You know, he's a very, very competent operator. I would urge him to go back, because it is a week today since we launched that paper, and no one has come up with a fault in it. We had lots of ad hominem abuse, but you get that on Twitter the whole time. But nobody has tripped it up, either in the Irish government, in the Commission, or in the Westminster government. So nobody wants to put up, quote, a hard border. There is no hard border now, but there's a border. There's a tax border. There's a VAT border. There's an excise duty border. There's a currency border. And very importantly, there's a security border. It is all managed in an orderly manner with existing technologies and existing administrative techniques. And exactly the same can apply if we move to a free trade deal or we move to world trade terms.
afraid we're pretty tight on time. We'll have to continue the Irish border question discussion, I think, after the event. But I do appreciate your question earlier. We have time just for one more question. I'll take it from Ambassador Terry Miller, who heads the Index of Economic Freedom.
Thank you very much for your presentation. If I understand correctly, getting back to the Chequers plan, you've got the government right now negotiating with the EU based on some principles that do not enjoy or cannot enjoy the approval of Parliament ultimately. It seems like an impossible situation. And can you explain how going forward the politics of this might work to get out of that impossible situation right now?
Well, I think it's pretty simple, actually. Thanks to quite a strong caucus of Remain MPs in Parliament, it's been decided there will be quite a meaningful vote in Parliament on the final deal, which gives MPs the chance to vote against it. If this had meaningfully not happened, Chequers would have gone through under statutory legislation, what's called a statutory instrument, a secondary legislation, and it would have been slipped through in a committee on a wet Thursday afternoon with a government majority, and no one could have stopped it. Now there will have to be a vote, and I will vote against it, and we estimate about 80 ERG members will vote against it, and Emily Thornberry said last week that the Labour Party will vote against it. So as far as I'm concerned, this thing is dead. So the quicker we can just bury it and forget about it and pass on, because it's embarrassing, the better. And it doesn't work practically. And we got advice from some people with long experience in the freight forwarding industry and in customs broking. Guy came over from Holland at our press conference last week, and to our astonishment, he said at the press conference, he's asked British officials, what do you do about VAT? And they mumbled. They've not worked out what to do about VAT. That is pretty fundamental. VAT is the key purchase tax across Europe. They hadn't worked it out. Yesterday, there was a meeting of customs brokers, and I heard back from him early this morning. There wasn't a single member of the Customs Brokers Association that thought this is workable. It's a complete practical non-starter. Unfortunately, it's been cooked up by civil servants without consulting the then democratically elected ministers who had to resign because they knew nothing about this plan. The quicker we just bury it, because we are beginning to get tight on time, and we move rapidly on to a big, bold, open free trade deal, which would have very widespread support across Parliament, the better.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of the. I'm afraid the event is we're out of time, but. Well, thanks very much. And Owen, just briefly. Yeah.
That's marvellous. I mean, we want the very, very closest relations, obviously, not just between Westminster and Dublin, but between Belfast and Dublin. I spent 3 years. I've done a lot of business with when I was in business. In Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. I had long experience with dealing with both sides of the border. I was the Shadow Secretary of State, which is the opposition spokesman. I went to Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland every week for 3 years. And then I was the real Secretary of State for 2 years. And I went obviously more than every week for 2 years. So I do have a little bit of experience on this. And nobody has to lecture me about the 70s. I came in after all the horrors, and we were trying to settle things down and make the agreement work. I'm absolutely as clear as possible about the dangers of it, about some threats from very, very evil people, very small number, who would like to disrupt this. But do not underestimate that the core of the Belfast Agreement was the reassurance of the Unionists in Northern Ireland that the constitutional status of Northern Ireland would not change without their consent. And that's the key point in this. I don't see the danger from idiotic, dangerous, vile, criminal, dissident groups sort of blowing up ANPR cameras, which are there, of course, at the moment, which we say is not necessary. The bigger danger, and it really is a danger, is disillusion amongst unionists who, without a vote, will have had a very dramatic change in their constitutional status. Now, that is a clear breach of the agreement. Well, you've got to listen to David Trimble. And David was an incredibly courageous individual. He took this agreement through at great personal expense. He got a Nobel Prize for it. And he and John Hume were remarkable. And you've got to listen to someone like him with his depth of knowledge.
I'd like to thank Owen Paterson for a tremendous event today, extremely informative and I think a very much up-to-date perspective on the state of the Brexit negotiations, and you know, we've had the privilege of hosting Owen here several times here at Heritage, and each time it's been extremely helpful to us here in the United States to gain the very latest perspective on the Brexit front. So, Owen, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to everybody for joining us for today's event.
Very good young audience.